Pearsall flashed last year, despite a rocky start where he got shot off the field, missed some time, came back, athletically very, very gifted, and now has an immense opportunity. Your thoughts on Pearsall, a very popular breakout candidate for a lot of analysts right now?
Yeah, he's definitely one for me as well. I actually think he just has an entirely different role that's a little more like Cooper Kupp-esque, and I kind of think that's the role that Shanahan is eyeing for a guy like Ricky Pearsall. So, like, forget about like what Deebo Samuel has done or any of that stuff. Like, I think this is this offense is going to look very different this year because it already started to look very different last year. What?
Why are you shaking your head? You're welcome.
Redraft ends, but Dynasty is life. I'm Theo Gremminger. This week, cool episode. We're talking about breakout rookie and second-year wide receivers with Matt Harmon. Matt, first time here on Dynasty Life. Excited to have you here. A lot of times, this is the best edge we have in Dynasty and certainly in fantasy, embracing players that maybe didn't pop as much as we wanted to see in year one. Sometimes players that did pop but have a little bit extra left in the tank and could take it to another level. And then certainly rookie wide receivers have been absolute cheat code over the last few seasons. 4 out of the last 5 years, we've had a rookie wide receiver or 2 last year finish as top 6 PPR scorers. So really excited to talk to you today. How excited are you sort of about this rookie wide receiver class from a bird's eye view?
Yeah, I think the rookie wide receiver class, and first of all, Theo, thank you for having me. Really appreciate it. I'm very excited about this conversation. But yeah, I think the rookie class was really interesting because it was very different from the guys in the 2024 class where there weren't exactly like these studs, right? Like these mainline, these guys are going to the top 10. We did end up having 2 guys, if you want to group Travis Hunter as a wide receiver, which I think is his future in the NFL is as a close to full-time wide receiver. We did end up having 2 guys go in the top 10, but they weren't quite as just like set it and forget it, sure things as, you know, Harrison and Neighbors, like they were going in the top 10, no doubt about it throughout the process, but it was like a collection of really interesting guys that could maybe be number 2s or number 3s in the NFL, which from a fantasy perspective, it's not as, again, we're just moonwalking right into an elite target share like Malik Neighbors as a rookie or anything like that. However, like those guys can end up being real difference makers in the right situation and if they get into the right ecosystems, which we'll talk about some of that for sure. The backdrop is, though, that, man, I think that 2024 class, like I thought it was special at the time, charting those guys as prospects. Looking at what they've been in the NFL, like I think we're going to look back on this group as a really awesome class, not just the obvious guys who have kind of already had those breakout seasons, but I'm sure we'll talk through some players today that I'm very excited about that maybe haven't like popped yet statistically, but I think could get there in year 2 and year 3.
Yeah, there's a lot of very cool opportunities for these second-year players and could take this class to an even higher level. You're seeing right now Malik Neighbors just locked in every single first-round FFPC, underdog, NFFC. Brian Thomas Jr. also right in that range. Lad McConkey, we'll talk about him a little later. But if some of those other players can take it up a notch, then we could be talking about a historically great class and a class that produces just multiple wide receiver ones. So let's get it started. There's a couple of really hot button issues for dynasty managers. And I think specifically one that we've seen a great shift on recently is Luther Burden enthusiasm versus people starting to fade Rome Odunze. Odunze, before the NFL draft, had steamed up to wide receiver 2 land, really in all formats. Like dynasty managers, of course, already had him steamed up, but we saw early best ball drafters on Underdog drafting him with confidence, right around wide receiver 23, wide receiver 24. There's been a significant decrease in his ADP. And dynasty-wise, I'm also seeing it in startup values where people are super duper excited about Luther Burden. Also, they inject the number 1 tight end in the class, Colston Loveland, who they took at 10th overall. So let's unwind this and take a look at the situation. Specifically, your thoughts on Luther Burden. I know there's a number of people who are very, very high on him. There's also some people who are sort of apprehensive because of his decline last year at Missouri, but an absolute nuts landing spot. Your thoughts on Burden as a Bear?
Yeah, Burden as a prospect, I think, was an probably the most difficult evaluation of this year's crop because, like I mentioned, we necessarily didn't see in this group that, like, okay, we got a bunch of future number one wide receivers like we did in the 2024 group. But I think Burden had the flashes of a guy that could be a number one in the NFL, could be somebody that you flow your entire passing game through. But the problem is, we don't just grade to the flashes, right? You have to look at the whole player profile holistically. Like the tough thing about Burden is that he is a guy who spent almost all of his snaps in the slot. In reception perception, he was an over 80% slot rate player, but he wasn't a good or consistent zone beater. Like guys that are that heavy slot usage players, I want them like over 80% success rate versus zone coverage, maybe multiple levels over. And he just wasn't that guy. Like I didn't think he had a great feel for routes working over the middle against zone coverage in particular. Like I think that is an area where he needs to develop. That being said, he faced more zone coverage again than any prospect I charted this year. And he's actually is the second highest routes versus zone in the RP prospect database. So it wasn't as if he saw a lot of man coverage, but when he did, I thought the reps were really quality. I thought that was where his separation ability was best expressed, particularly working like out routes from the slot against man coverage, really high success rate there, corner routes. So I see like the flashes of sort of like a Bud Light Diet Coke version of Malik Neighbors. Like I think that is in his range of outcomes, but it's just, you don't see it consistently. But I do see why Ben Johnson wanted him for his offense, because he does put players in conflict in space. Like he's a great tackle breaker. He's bigger, faster, stronger than you think with the ball in his hands. Honestly, his player comparison to me, like in an upside situation, ironically, would be a guy like DJ Moore. And I actually don't think that the Luther Burden, Rome Odunze like selections have anything to do with each other, because I think they'll play very different positions. Like ideally in an NFL offense, you want Rome Odunze to be like a true X receiver. That's where his ability flashes the best. I don't think he's a future power slot or anything like that. I think you want him working against press man coverage on the outside. But, Burden is like a move around guy, flanker, slot. And I think that's ideally who DJ Moore is as well. So that's where, to me, there's overlap in skill. And in early fantasy drafts, like the guy that goes before everybody is DJ Moore. And that I think is an interesting thing to investigate.
Yeah, it's a lot to unpack here. Burden inside the slot, like Ben Johnson, synonymous with so much slot success, going back even to the time that he was with Jarvis Landry in Miami. And it seems like Ben Johnson has done everything he can to sort of talk up Luther Burden, called him a stud. You mentioned Rome Odunze. That's a lot of the reason, Matt, and I think that's telling where you say he's not a power slot. He's a guy you want to play on the outside, because I think that was a lot of the argument for fading him and his decline is Burden sort of boxes out his slot usage. But that's interesting, because if you're taking that out of the equation, then fading him really seems kind of like a moot point. And when you talk about DJ Moore is the highest drafted one now, but he could be gone in 2026. So you could be talking about a Luther Burden, Rome Odunze, wide receiver 1, wide receiver 2 duo, and you think that they could coexist quite well.
Right. Yeah. And by the way, like we're talking about who's the Amon-Ra St. Brown role and all this type of stuff. Ben Johnson's talked about, hey, like I've had high slot usage players in my offense because Jarvis Landry is a slot receiver. Amon-Ra St. Brown is a slot receiver. If you can actually map Amon-Ra, I want to do a whole breakdown on this on YouTube, like going through like his full historic RP data. I just haven't gotten around to it just yet, but you can really map like when St. Brown started breaking out as a slot player with routes closer to the line of scrimmage later in his rookie season, when Ben Johnson had a larger voice in that room. So yeah, I think he does want like a high quality slot receiver, but I think it's more so he's built his offense around the strength of his players. It's the same thing that, trying to compare Caleb Williams to Jared Goff. Ideally, you don't want you want him to do some of the things that Jared Goff does, get the ball out quickly, work over the middle of the field, and be a very decisive quarterback. But you don't want to turn Caleb Williams into Jared Goff. You want to structure the offense around what Caleb Williams does well and these pass catchers at the same time. And I do think that Ben Johnson will do that. So yeah, to me, I do think there's a role where I think Rome Odunze is going to get some slot usage because he was productive from the slot last year. He's actually, from a yards per out run perspective, more productive from the slot. I think he will get those chances, just like I don't think Luther Burden has to be a slot only player or DJ Moore has to be pigeonholed into a role here. But I do think that the future of the Bears wide receiver room is most likely Rome Odunze is your X receiver who's on the line of scrimmage and can win press man coverage in a way that Jameson Williams couldn't for the Detroit Lions last year on that high level. But that's why you move him around the formation. And that wasn't St. Brown's game either. So this is kind of like a new thing for Ben Johnson and his offense. Whereas I do think there's some decent overlap between what Luther Burden has done and a little bit of like almost Theo like blending some of what Jameson Williams was and Amon-Ra St. Brown is. So I can tell why he is excited about having this guy in his passing game.
Yeah, that was going to be my next question was, do you see Luther Burden sort of as a, not a like for like Jameson Williams, but somebody who could be used on sort of those high value looks like Jameson Williams had last year in Detroit, just to utilize the explosiveness that Burden has. And you seem to think so. So, I mean, for me, Burden has been a guy that the rise has been completely warranted. Is he a guy that you're moving up your dynasty rankings as well? It's really just, it's an unbelievable potential situation for him.
Yeah, he is somebody that I've liked a little bit in the post-draft process. I liked him a lot pre-draft, by the way, Luther Burden. Like, again, I kind of ranked him as a back half of the first round, early second round type player, which is where he ended up ultimately going, because I think if you were just grading to the flashes, he looks like the best receiver in the class. So from a dynasty perspective, I really like this landing spot because I just think Ben Johnson is so good at intentionally using and deploying his players. And like we're talking, like if you just look back at the guys last year, St. Brown, 44% snaps in the slot, Jameson Williams, 30% snaps in the slot. Like this offense is going to feel dynamic. They're going to move these guys around. And Luther Burden is somebody that I do think early on in his NFL career will need some role catering to be like a highly successful player. And I really trust Ben Johnson to be the coordinator and play caller to do it.
Matt, let everybody know about Reception Perception, how it started, how it came to be, and what you're doing over there on that site.
Yeah, appreciate it. Reception Perception is my baby. It is something that I started 12 years ago now, which is crazy. Like putting the early kind of back stuff together, because to me, there's a lot of good stats out there. I mean, even like the good ones, that like you guys collect at FantasyPoints, like yards per route run, and that's been like a staple of the industry. But we all know that wide receiver production, what we want in fantasy football, like the stats, the catches, the yards, the touchdowns, those are all inherently dependent on outside variables in order to accrue the production. Like we were talking about with the Bears duo, how are you deployed? Like, what's your role on the field? Also, your relationship with the quarterback. Also, is the quarterback any good? Does the quarterback have time behind the offensive line? Reception Perception, my goal was to isolate player ability, not just within the role that they play, but how they compare to other players throughout the league. The main metrics are this, success rate versus coverage. How often are you getting open against man zone press? But there's a variety of metrics to really give you the full picture of who a wide receiver is. So on the site, which has been in existence now, I believe since the last 5 years, collect league-wide data, prospect data, put up full profiles on these guys. We have 3 tiers of subscription, so I like to think there's something for everybody.
Awesome. And how about podcast-wise? Where can people find you now and during the season?
Oh my God, I feel like I do too many podcasts.
Well, promote one of them, Matt. Just cherry pick one.
My bosses would be very happy if I told you that the Yahoo Fantasy Forecast is a great show that people can listen to with me and all of the folks there at Yahoo, plus rotating guests from across the industry 5 days a week during the season. Also this year, I can announce this. We'll be doing live shows, so really fun. Definitely, you can find that anywhere that you get your podcasts.
Awesome stuff. Highly recommend all of Matt's work. So we talked about the Chicago Bears wide receivers. Let's talk about the Los Angeles Chargers wide receivers. Ladd McConkey has been a player that we're going to get to in a moment, but we've got to talk about Tre Harris. Tre Harris was a guy who, like Luther Burden, had polarizing opinions about him on both sides during the draft lead-up process, like the process for the draft lead-up. But what's interesting is the people who were very bullish on Tre Harris were extremely bullish. Like there was a Tre Harris hive, and now the hive is sort of flexing because they got a great landing spot. Obviously, LA, there's definitely going to be some target competition, to say the least, in Ladd McConkey, but stylistically, Harris fills a major need and you get the very strong quarterback play with Justin Herbert, strong offensive line play. There's not a lot to dislike about this landing spot.
No, and I think from like a schematic standpoint, and a role assignment standpoint, this is perfect for Tre Harris. Like when that card came up, I remember saying to the guys on the Yahoo Draft show, like, oh yeah, this is exactly what I think Tre Harris needed. And I think it's exactly what the Los Angeles Chargers needed. Now, from the Tre Harris part of it, Mike Williams is on the roster. I think we all know that Mike Williams is towards the end of his career. He's also not a guy that's any sort of lock to play the majority of the season. But I think for the first, let's call it, 4, 5, 6, 7 weeks of the season, he can run out there as the X receiver. And that's going to allow some development and ramp up time for a guy like Tre Harris. So I think and he's going to need that, because if you look at Tre Harris's role in college, he's mostly stuck on like a straight line. He is the vast majority, over almost 50% of his routes are a 9 or a curl in his reception perception profile. Now he runs those routes really well. He's also really good at slants, working against press man coverage, but again, he's some time and seasoning to develop into more of a full-time wide receiver. I think he will get that with Mike Williams being on the roster, but then once he's ready to rock, once he's onboarded as that X, he gets Ladd McConkey so perfectly. And again, this is the type of player that the Chargers needed, someone to play that X receiver position. So you bump Quentin Johnston out of that role, because if QJ is going to be a quality contributor for you, it was never going to come at X, because he can't track the ball over his shoulder and he's not a consistent press coverage beater. Harris does show the ability to do both of those things, which is why I really like him kind of assuming that role, and then maybe bumping Quentin Johnston to that move around flanker type role where he can threaten the defense more horizontally.
Very interesting stuff. So Tre Harris, like when you're talking about him hitting a fantasy ceiling, is there sort of a stylistic comp or a player that you could circle NFL wise, or potentially just as limited as saying, Tre Harris could be a wide receiver 2 type player in this offense, a wide receiver 3? Is there sort of a ceiling you would put on him operating in a Greg Roman offense opposite a highly targeted slot like Ladd McConkey?
Yeah. So I think from like a midline player perspective, I think you're maybe looking at somebody like Alec Pierce, which nobody's getting excited about that, like for your fantasy team, right? He's going to have those big weeks and stuff like that. But I think like that's kind of sort of the meridian, the midline of this straight line X receiver archetype. I do think from like a ceiling perspective, maybe this is the absolute ceiling of a player that has this type of skill, this level of deployment. It's a guy like DK Metcalf. And I think, the Chargers were linked to Metcalf as like a trade option. That would sort of make sense if they're looking for that type of role.
Yeah, I mean, that's hitting the DK Metcalf level would be a huge, huge win for dynasty managers selecting Tre Harris. And what's interesting is Seattle was also linked to Tre Harris in the build-up process, sort of as a potential like for like. So we'll definitely circle that one. Pierce to Metcalf is sort of a wide range of outcomes, but any way you cut it, it's a big athletic wide receiver in the LA mix. Let's talk about Ladd McConkey, though, because this is an important one. I've talked about this with a couple of analysts where sometimes in Dynasty, a guy really, really peaks and they're very, very talented, but it's a potential sell window because they're hitting their absolute Dynasty ceiling. When it comes to Ladd McConkey, it feels like there could be a little bit of gas in the tank and a little more room for him to run. But right now, he is wide receiver 11 on Keep Trade Cut. So the Dynasty marketplace embracing him. On Underdog, he's wide receiver 11. In FFPC 350s, which is a redraft contest, he's going right around 18, 19 overall. So McConkey has steamed up big time. Do you think that the inflated price tag is worth it? Certainly, we saw what he's capable for in a spike week, like we saw in the NFL playoffs, where he set the record for receiving yardage as a rookie. Like recency bias is strong with Ladd. How about for a full season? Can he deliver another sort of taking his game to another level? And last year was 15 points per game. So if he can take it up 2 or 3 points, you're talking about strong wide receiver 1 numbers.
Yeah, forget like rookie receiving yardage record in the playoffs. He probably had to set the record for most yards in a playoff game to who was number 2 on his team, right? Because the second guy was like Will Dissly with sub 20 yards in that Texans game. Outrageous performance from Ladd McConkey. I thought it was an outrageous performance all season long. I really truly believe that if you're looking at these rookie receivers last year and you're just watching them on fit, like forget about their pedigree, their resume, draft capital. I think the best rookie on film was Ladd McConkey. He has the best success rate versus man, the best success rate versus press. He's not a slot only player. He can win from multiple lines. His yards per route run is actually higher on the outside than it is on the inside. Now he's obviously going to be a slot heavy player. He was a slot heavy player last season. That there's no like limitations to that. He can also play outside in 2 receiver sets. He's unbelievably good in the intermediate area. Like Justin Herbert instantly trusted him there. My favorite thing about Ladd McConkey is even when he's working against zone coverage, he always knows when to kind of like bend the route a little, even if it's just like a 90-degree dig route, he'll bend it so that he's always kind of on leverage with the zone coverage. And that's just something that's so critical for a lot of these rookies don't do that, man. All the rookies this year, there's some of them that are true. They're like deer in the headlight when they're working against zone coverage. McConkey is not. I think he, again, best rookie on film last year, has a true wide receiver 1 ceiling. Like I'm in line with all of those rankings that you just threw out there. And the only question for me with him is just, can he stay healthy? Like, I'd love it if he didn't have to like scrape himself off the ground every time he caught a pass, but he's so dangerous in the open field. I also don't, because that's another thing. Great contested catch player and a great tackle breaker. Like there's nothing about his individual game that I have any questions about. So I don't want to say like, hey, maybe he needs to go to the Tyler Lockett school of like avoiding contact to stay healthy, like we saw Lockett do towards the end of his career. But the durability really is the only thing that I worry about with McConkey.
Yeah, we're very, very high on McConkey here. Chris Wecht, who does our projections, has him as the wide receiver 8 this year. So I think it's worth using a early pick on him. Everything's sort of set up for success in this offense. Going to talk about another year 2 potential breakout. We've talked about Rome Odunze. We've talked about Ladd McConkey. And we're going to talk about Ricky Pearsall and his chance to take it a big step into the shoes of Deebo Samuel. And Ricky Pearsall has steamed up in ADP. Not to the extent that we're seeing some of these guys like the Lads, but Pearsall is being comfortably drafted inside of wide receiver 3 land. We saw him have 2 very big games to end last season. One of them was week 18 when fantasy leagues were not going, but Pearsall flashed last year despite a rocky start where he got shot off the field, missed some time, came back, athletically very, very gifted, and now has an immense opportunity with Brandon Ayuk banged up and Deebo Samuel now a Washington Commander. Your thoughts on Pearsall, a very popular breakout candidate for a lot of analysts right now?
Yeah, he's definitely one for me as well. First of all, I was really high on Pearsall as a prospect. I actually was not, he was a little bit like a surprising pick at the end of the first round. That wasn't too big of a surprise to me because I was where I had him ranked as like a late first round option. I just loved his route running. I loved his ability to separate and win at the catch point. And it certainly took some time to see that at the NFL level. But yeah, Theo, like we can't have a conversation about Ricky Pearsall, not say like the guy was freaking shot in August, right before the season kicks off, shot in the chest. And then not even just that, like he was dealing with injuries throughout the course of the offseason. And this is just like we talked about Luther Burden earlier, who's dealing with a soft tissue injury right now. I always get nervous about rookie receivers who miss time in camp because I think it can just put them a little bit behind the 8 ball. Even you look at a guy like Jackson Smith-Njigba and his for his rookie season, he misses time late in the preseason with a wrist injury. It took him a minute to get like ramped back up. So with Pearsall, there's multiple things that get him off to a slow start. We don't even see him till week 7. And I thought the film early on when he just got back, I was like, I don't really want to be harsh on this guy, but it's taken him a minute to get all the way sped up. But then those final 4 weeks, not just the game against the Lions, but like even that Thursday night game against the Rams, he is just tearing up man coverage. His success rate versus man coverage in just those 4 games was, up there with some of the top performers in the league. And my theory on that is like, hey, the 49ers coaching staff watched those games, the Dolphins game, the Rams game before that week 17 matchup against the Lions, one of the most man coverage heavy defenses in the NFL. And like, hey, we got to start featuring this guy. Like, we got to start throwing him the football more. He breaks out in that game. I think it just kind of all lines up. He's not a slot only guy. Like, he can play multiple positions in this offense, which I think is pretty critical. So this is like very simple base analysis, but in early drafts where those 49ers receivers are all kind of bunched up, like there's going to be a right answer from this group. And because Pearsall goes last among the 3, at least for now, Ayuk, Jennings, and then Pearsall, I'm just taking the guy who I think is a really good player and is last in the group there.
Yeah, wide receiver 41 on Underdog seems like a really, really good entry point. One thing that's interesting about Pearsall, we know he's an elite athlete, completely tore up the combine, had probably the greatest catch ever for a collegiate player, like the nastiest highlight catch ever. And if you think I'm exaggerating, just Google the words Ricky Pearsall versus Charlotte. It was like Michael Jordan level athleticism. So we know Pearsall's athletic. When we talk about the Deebo Samuel role, Deebo always led the NFL in rush attempts. And certainly that's not at the wide receiver position. And that's certainly not going to be Pearsall. But do you view him as the player that internally the 49ers coaching staff says this guy could be the manufactured touch guy in our offense? Let's get him some of those manufactured looks right around the line of scrimmage that could maybe raise his fantasy floor, create more opportunities for explosive plays, and sort of emulate a little bit of the physicality that they lost from Deebo.
I'm so glad that you asked me this, because one of my little pet theories is that the selection of Ricky Pearsall actually was a signal on draft night. Not that, oh, hey, we're going away from Deebo Samuel at some point. I think we all knew that was coming. That was rather obvious. But it was actually that they're going in a different direction entirely offensively, because I think this is certainly gone a little it's gone very discussed in the fantasy community, but I think it's gone just a little overlooked in the NFL community as a whole, because the 49ers weren't good last year. They weren't the team that we expected them to be because of injuries and a lot of things that were just chaos driven for that team last season. But this offense looked very different last season than any other Shanahan offense in San Francisco. It was a lot more like true drop back stuff, like no play action, none of the typical like EPA cheesing, screens, gadgety stuff. Like they had Brock Purdy get in the shotgun or drop back under center and like run big boy concepts. And this really clicked to me actually watching Ricky Pearsall in the first couple, like especially the Kansas City game in week 7, where, like I said, the film wasn't good, but it was watching how he was being used, where he's running a lot of these like whip routes and option routes and return routes. There's not been another player in the 49ers offense in this like Deebo Samuel era that's been doing that. So I actually think he just has an entirely different role that's a little more like Cooper Kupp-esque. And by the way, like Cooper Kupp really broke out for the Rams when they ditched a lot of the kind of, I don't want to say Mickey Mouse, but the core like McVay Goff concepts and went to more true dropback stuff with Matthew Stafford. And I kind of think that's the role that Shanahan is eyeing for a guy like Ricky Pearsall. So like, forget about like what Deebo Samuel has done or any of that stuff. Like, I think this is this offense is going to look very different this year, because it already started to look very different last year.
Matt, you're doing everything you can to actually raise Ricky Pearsall's
price
in ADP. Don't ever use the Cooper Kupp word around Ricky Pearsall unless you want to get no exposure to him. Wait till you're done with your drafts at least.
Well, tell me about it. I know this is another thing that I kind of want to do like an extensive breakdown on, because this is a theory I've been sitting on, like I said, for since I did the in-season charting on Pearsall. I probably should have sent those like offers out, maybe mid season last year, because this is something I've been sitting on for a minute. But yeah, especially, giving a guy like Ricky Pearsall that Cooper Kupp comp, I'm never gonna be able to get him on any of my teams. That's for sure.
Yeah, I was going to ask about Jack Bech next, but we'll actually segue. We'll leave Bech away, so we'll go Kyle Williams next, so we don't go for the trio. Let's talk about Kyle Williams, though, another guy who's really, really rising up rookie draft. So if you had a rookie draft that was right after the NFL draft, Kyle Williams is a guy that you were getting in the 3rd round, sometimes late 2nd. You're starting to see Kyle Williams leapfrog guys like Bechel Tutin, guys like Cam Scadaboo, even Tre Harris. There is just this idea that Kyle Williams is falling into a perfect situation because he has early opportunity in New England to be a guy who has a pretty safe weekly floor in terms of usage, and long-term for dynasty managers, this could end up being sort of a big play guy for Drake May throughout his entire career. Williams had 14 touchdown catches last year for Washington State, which was the most in this entire draft class besides Travis Hunter. Williams is very interesting, had a very strong Senior Bowl, and again, didn't get the round 2 draft capital, but landed very well in round 3. Your thoughts on him, potential impact in New England, and your thoughts on him as a prospect?
Yeah, my thoughts on him as a prospect is like, God, I'm trying not to get too high on Kyle Williams, because this is like the exact type of archetype that I've been overweight on before, like these smaller separation, really good route runner receivers. I've been overweight on these type of players before, so I was trying to kind of keep myself cool on him. But man, I really like this player a lot. Again, he checks a lot of the boxes that I look for. 73.3% success rate versus man and reception perception. But unlike some of those kind of smaller route runner separation types that I've liked and haven't necessarily gone on to become superstar receivers in the NFL, Kyle Williams is awesome with the ball in his hands. When you get him into open space, and this is something I chart in reception perception, like your amount of catches that are in space where there's an opportunity for you to break a tackle, and you're like, again, in open space, not like you catch it and you got a curl route along the sideline and you get tackled right away. 66.6% of his catches were in space, and he went down on first contact on just 44% of those plays. Like, the guy can break tackles and do something with the ball in his hands. So I really do think he's a good fit in this offense. I think him and Drake May, like, they can have a connection that's pretty similar to like where Drake May loved to target Josh Downs when they were together at UNC. And obviously we know this is a wide receiver room that has ample opportunity there as well. So I definitely like getting Kyle Williams when you could get him in those, like in the third round of rookie drafts. But there was a spot where I was at 2.8 and somebody ahead of me had 2.7. And I was like, what do I got to do to trade up one spot just so I can secure Kyle Williams? So I think that was still like a comfortable range to take him. I felt very confident doing that there.
Yeah, Kyle Williams is super interesting, and we'll see how much Stephon Diggs has like left in the tank. They certainly paid him a lot of money, but it's just the availability.
I actually think, by the way, Theo, like that Diggs is maybe like a ceiling comparison for Kyle Williams. Like, I think there's some stylistic similarities there that is kind of interesting. If it's, I think Diggs is actually in a pretty good spot with his rehab based on everything that we're seeing right now. And he actually played better last year in isolation against man coverage and people maybe give him credit for. So I think maybe we could see it like, hey, it's Diggs early on, and then he's learning from Kyle Williams, or Kyle Williams is learning from Diggs over the course of his rookie season.
If we're going by off-field swag, then Stephon Diggs is ready to have another wide receiver one season, because he's sitting courtside at a Knicks game. And I don't know if you saw the pictures from the Met Gala, but Diggs had about the swaggiest outfit of any human could possibly have. So
look, people that follow my work and have for a long time know that Diggs and I are, I mean, number one, he's like one of the best reception perception performers of all time. And Steph and I actually have a pretty good relationship as well. So, I mean, the guy, as I've said to him many times, he can pull off some things stylistically that on field and certainly off the field that I would never be able to imagine doing. So yeah, definitely. I'm still a fan of his on field play. Fashion choices. Yeah. I'm much more of a simple man.
Yeah, there you go. But yeah, Stephon Diggs, that'll be another interesting one. We're certainly not talking veterans, but if Kyle Williams can step on and give us what you think he can give us, and Stephon Diggs can just be a little bit, the points per game last year in Houston were strong, but it was such a low ADOT role. I think for the Patriots offense to take another step, Diggs is going to have a little bit higher ADOT this year.
Yeah. But
if those two guys can hit, then Drake May becomes a real interesting value this year at his price tag. So New England, definitely an offense to watch. Another offense that fantasy managers have their eyes on is Vegas. And how could you not? Pete Carroll, Chip Kelly, they draft Ashton Genty. We have the greatest tight end who ever lived at tight end for them in Brock Bowers. Geno Smith gets extended. They trade for him. The Pete Carroll, Geno Smith reunion. But now you also have Jack Bech. And Jack Bech is an interesting one because we loved him at the Senior Bowl, ends up getting Senior Bowl MVP. Very interesting prospect. He has great size, great versatility. Played some tight end early in his career as sort of an undersized tight end at LSU. But he's athletic enough, but he's also just big. Standing next to Jack Bech, I felt like you were almost standing next to a tight end. Easily like a 215-pound, 6'2" player. Ends up in an offense where Vegas was a free square landing spot for a wide receiver, because besides Jacoby Myers, not a whole lot there. Trey Tucker ran a lot of routes last year, but certainly not an every down wideout. Bech feels like a player that might be a little bit underrated based on his skill set and available opportunity.
Yeah, by the way, Trey Tucker, not only did he run a lot of routes, he ran the most routes among the second year receivers, because this is like I said, I just started year two, like guys that are going to year two. So now I've moved on to the year three players. I just pull up my database on True Media. All right, who we look at? Oh, Trey Tucker, 639 routes. More.
Scott Barrett made this point a couple times where Jack Bech has such a low bar to cross in terms of if it's just if we go by like targets per route run, yards per route run, fantasy points per route run, if we can just take the Tre Tucker targets and put him over to Jack Bech, it's such a low bar for him to just have some sort of fantasy football viability. I believe Tre Tucker was like 6th among all wide receivers in routes run last year. Like insane routes run.
Insane stuff. And yeah, 81 targets and 47 catches to show for it. So certainly long story short, Vegas needed a wide receiver to go along with Jakobi Meyers, who is, one of the more perennially underrated players at the position. So I didn't originally conceive of Vegas as a landing spot for Jack Bech because Jack Bech is such an interesting player. Number one, he was one of my favorite prospects in this class. I was a huge fan of Jack Bech. So to me, because I think he fits. Like, I don't think he's a slot only guy. I don't think he has to be like a power slot because he was really good against press coverage. But it was, he's playing on one side of the field. He's playing in the Big 12 and TCU offense. Like, I do think if you're going to maximize him as a player, you don't want him to just run out an X receiver, especially because he doesn't threaten you downfield. If you look at his route success rate chart at reception perception, it's a lot of green, except on the 9 and the corner route. Like you mostly want him separating short and intermediate. So yeah, as we're thinking about him, like, is he kind of one of these big slot receivers? I'm thinking about teams like, that are off that McVay tree, Houston, right? Like obviously they end up going with the Iowa State guys. Trying to think about one of those type of teams for Bech to land on. I didn't conceive of Vegas, but when they end up being the team that drafted him, you remember back in 2014, the Eagles with Chip Kelly as the head coach back then drafted Jordan Matthews, and Jordan Matthews was a 6'3", 200. He actually is. I think the Panthers actually just released him, but he played tight end for the Panthers last year. Like he was one of the original big slot receivers because he was like a slot only guy. And obviously we saw what Ohio State's offense did with Emeka Egbuka last year as another kind of bigger slot player. So it makes sense that they're sort of targeting him for this role. And I think the first question for people is, well, okay, does that work with Jakobi Meyers in the room and Brock Bowers kind of doing some detached from the formation, running a lot of slot, as well. But Meyers actually only was in the slot on 33% of his snaps last year. He is a guy who can play outside. And I think Bech can play outside too, but he fits really well in an offense that I think wants to get the ball out quick and work horizontally. That's where Bech to me is best. His strengths are best expressed. So I love Bech. I think he's a really good fit in this offense. And I was just very, very, very high on him as a prospect.
Yeah, and what's interesting is we talk about from a 2026 lens, if Vegas were to sort of move off of Jakobi Meyers, Bech stepping into a similar target share, that's in the range of outcomes. And I actually think he meshes well with Bowers as well. Bowers is going to be probably the most targeted tight end in football this year, and for most years moving on. The target ceiling is silly, but Jack Bech becoming a continual wide receiver too, I don't think that's out of the realm of possibilities. I think he's a great value right now. Let's talk about another year 2 player. And I'm sort of like the resident Xavier Worthy stan. I'm very high on Xavier Worthy. There's a lot of Rashee Rice pushback, and certainly Rice to start last season had an unbelievable role. Sort of broke Fantasy Points data, target share, slot share, first read rate. He was like Mr. Fantasy Points, and so many people at Fantasy Points were touting him last season. Could have ended up being a league winner. Of course, misses the season with an injury. Worthy, on the other hand, sort of started off the season kind of weird. Had that big game against Baltimore, but didn't have many touches, and then had kind of sporadic usage. But towards the tail end of last season, they really leaned into Worthy. Worthy started having a lot of high touch games, had a lot of touchdown scores, and then, of course, had the big stat line in the Super Bowl. And I know one of the catches was late, but those count for our fantasy teams as well. Garbage time matters for us in fantasy football. So we'll let that touchdown stand. I'm very high on Worthy. There's been a little bit of pushback here. Sort of where are you at on Worthy? Right now, I'd say everybody sort of ranks him inside of wide receiver 2 land, but does he have a little bit more room to run there? Is a spike week season in play, or is he a guy that's going to, again, take a big backseat usage-wise to Rashee Rice when they're both on the field?
Yeah, that's really the critical question. Is less about like, what do you think about Xavier Worthy and what do you think about Rashee Rice? Because really when Worthy popped off towards the back end of last season and then into the playoffs, it was a lot of like move around stuff, get him into the slot and get him on these kind of quick hitting sort of designer passes. that's mostly like the Rashee Rice role. And I think long term, well, I don't want to say it's the Rashee Rice role, because how they win in that is very different. Like, you could just look at the ADOT and, you know, the alignment stuff. And I posted about this at one point. It is very like similar, right? But it's the way they do those things are very, very different, because like some of Xavier Worthy's best stuff is running these like quick out routes, flats against man coverage, because you're just never going to be able to cover him in that sort of situation. Whereas with Rashee Rice, think about that Ravens opener where Xavier Worthy is stretching the field out vertically, and it's just slant in, slant in, slant in over and over again for Rashee Rice. Like, that guy was going to catch 120 passes bare minimum last season if he stayed healthy. So like, I think they can work together in tandem. And because the Chiefs offense is just so unusual, like they don't have these roles where it's like X slot Z. It's kind of everybody moves around, and they don't have like one true target hog X receiver. And certainly none of the guys on the roster right now profile as that. So I think they can work in concert, but I just kind of, if Rice is healthy and he's on the field and he's fully operational, I think I have a better understanding of like what his role is if he's hogging targets. And I actually kind of compared his rookie season reception perception data to Amon-Ra St. Brown's rookie season reception perception data. Now, St. Brown has developed further than just that. And I think Rice, we just don't know because we only saw 4 games, but really like 3.5 games last year. So that's kind of a critical question to me. If Worthy's going to hit, him and Mahomes have to be more on the same page on these like downfield passes, because like Worthy can get open downfield. There's no question about it. They just weren't always like hitting on those plays last year. So I do think if Worthy's going to hit for fantasy, it will be in these like downfield spike week ways, whereas Rice will probably be the volume guy underneath.
Yeah, it's very interesting. And I think Worthy sort of has a range of outcomes here where he was sub 100 targets last year. They gave him like 20 rush attempts, though. There's going to be some leaning on Kansas City giving him the manufactured looks, but those spike weeks could add up. For me, I want to have exposure to both of them, but I'm certainly going to take Worthy when I get the discount. It's really hard to fade this sort of speed and explosiveness attached to Patrick Mahomes when we already saw him score 9 touchdowns last year. So I think that you really want exposure to both. And I love that you brought up Amon-Ra St. Brown with Rashee Rice. Rashee Rice is also a great value right now, certainly an underdog in the 3rd round. Really, really an easy click for best ball managers. And if Rashee Rice didn't get hurt last year, then not to get too best ball specific, I think we'd be talking about Rashee Rice being an early 2nd round pick just based on the way that season was headed. So very, very interesting one. Let's talk about Jayden Higgins. Jayden Higgins was another player who landed extremely well. The Houston wide receiver 2 role has been really fantasy friendly over the years. Basically, the player opposite Nico Collins has thrived. We saw Tank Dell. We saw Stephon Diggs. Even guys like Noah Brown in small sample sizes. CJ Stroud has leaned into this sort of player. Jayden Higgins checks off a lot of boxes, Matt. Big, strong, and also has the ability to get downfield, athletically gifted, could play a little bit inside as a big slot, just happened to play next to Jaylin Noel in college. Higgins seems like a guy who's going to step in and have a potentially strong role as a rookie.
Yeah, now he's going to be playing alongside Jaylin Noel again with the Houston Texans. So, and I just straight up preferred Noel as a prospect. Now, obviously, Jayden Higgins goes a whole round, or if not more than that. It's ironic, actually. I compared Jaylin Noel to Josh Downs, and they both went 79th overall. And obviously, I think Downs has outproduced that, and I think Jaylin Noel is going to outproduce that as well. This is just like classic NFL sizeism, Theo. Like these like smaller, explosive route runners, they always just get discounted by the league. And that doesn't mean that Jayden Higgins is going to be a bad player. I actually think this was almost to me, sort of a like landing spot for Jayden Higgins, because if you look at him, like playing as Iowa State's X receiver last year, he just didn't show enough ability to separate against press man coverage for me to think he can be an NFL X receiver. I don't care that he's 6'4". I don't care that he runs a 4.4. To me, he gets stuck at the top of routes too often. And like those in breakers can really be an issue for him when he's working as a perimeter X receiver. Well, in Houston, he's not going to have to be that guy because they have Nico Collins. Like I mentioned, Nick Caley's the offensive coordinator now. He comes from the Rams tree the last couple of years. He also has a background with the Patriots system as well. So really diverse background. I'm excited to see him as an offensive coordinator here. I think Higgins can do some power slot stuff here for Houston. And also at time, I'm actually interested to see if that they do end up lining him up at X a couple times and move Nico Collins from that X receiver position at times. He'll still be the primary X, but he's been like an 80% outside, 80% on the line player, which the fact that he's been as efficient as he has been while playing in that role is just a testament to how damn good Nico Collins is as like a true tier 1 elite receiver. But I wonder how those guys kind of work in concert together, because I think this is a good landing spot for Higgins. He won't have to be an X receiver. He won't have to be a number 1. So he can kind of get moved away from that, because guys that are sub 35th percentile success rate versus man and press coverage in reception perception as prospects, the guys that have hit while doing that, they've all moved into being big slot receivers. So I hope that is the future for Higgins in Houston, because I think that's the best way for him to access like a target hog upside.
Yeah, I think really the big takeaway from this Higgins conversation is you're still very much in on Jaylin Noel. Yeah. I had Jaylin Noel one spot ahead of Higgins before the NFL draft, and then, of course, had to adjust based on the round disparity. But Noel has been a guy that's falling into third rounds continually of rookie drafts. And in terms of dynasty startups, you're talking about maybe a 5-6 round difference between a Jayden Higgins and a Jaylin Noel. Noel's super interesting, though, because do you think there's a little bit of Tank Dell there potentially in this offense for him? Just in talking about Noel, like we say he's small, but he's also like a brick, S house. I won't curse on the, he's really, really strong. And he also is really, really athletic. The guy had the most bench press repetitions for any wide receiver at the combine, and also ran extremely well. And when we talk about the Senior Bowl, Jaylin Noel was arguably the best offensive player in Mobile this year. Talk about your expectations for him.
I love Jaylin Noel. Was a big fan of him as a prospect. You mentioned that Tank Dell comparison. Like, I would say that the 3 routes that really were the difference-making routes for, 4 routes that were really the difference-making routes for Tank Dell as a rookie with CJ Stroud: post, corner, out, comeback. Those were some of, Tank Dell, it's just such a shame that, I don't know that we're going to see him this year. And obviously the injuries suck, because he was truly one of the best outbreaking route runners as a rookie, not among rookies, like in the NFL. He was one of the best outbreaking route runners, like in earning separation. And I think Jaylin Noel can do some of that as well. Again, those are 4 of his best routes in reception perception, and he ran those at a pretty high rate as well. So I'm excited to see that kind of added back to this offense, because I think it was a missing dimension last year. And I don't think Noel, who is a 74.1% success rate versus man player, which was the same as Lad McConkey, by the way, in his class, and I don't think McConkey's a slot only guy. I don't think Noel has to be a slot only player. And look, I know that the fantasy community is kind of, there's a lot of draft capital zealots, and I get it, right? Like, Higgins went ahead of Noel, but just go back to that Josh Downs example. Like, Alec Pierce was a 2nd round pick. Adonai Mitchell was a 2nd round pick. Shoot, even Michael Pittman's a 2nd round pick. I think Josh Downs is the best receiver in that room. And when he's on the field, he gets targeted at a higher rate than those guys. So, like, draft capital isn't everything. And I do think, like, quality eventually matters. I think this is a good spot for Higgins. I think it can also be a good spot for Jaylin Noel as well.
Another rookie who landed exceptionally well, but is still polarizing in the fantasy community, is Matthew Golden. Golden last year, over 17 yards per reception, led Texas in receiving yards. A lot of his best play and best film was late in the season, though. His 2 most dominant games were, of course, the SEC championship game and then that playoff game against Arizona State. Who knows what would have happened in the Ohio State game? He got knocked out of the game. Right. But this has been a guy where people who are into on-field production have some big concerns. But when it comes down to landing spots, I would argue that Green Bay was one of the best possible ones, because it was one of the only teams where he could land into a quasi wide receiver 1 type situation. Now, I know they're pouring cold water on it. All the front office speak that, Jayden Reed is still our number 1 guy. I'm not so sure about that. Your thoughts on Matthew Golden heading into the season? Is he underrated? Are the concerns about him valid, or are you willing to kind of push those aside?
Yeah, it would be a good way to tell Jayden Reed that he's your number 1 guy is, like, play him on every snap,
or give him or give him 100 targets for once in his career. Just 100, low bar.
That would be nice. Like, when you get man coverage, like, throw the ball to Jayden Reed. How about that? I really like Jayden Reed. I'm a big Jayden Reed fan. I enjoyed him as a prospect and loved what he did as a rookie. I think I was maybe hoping for one more step this year, but that could still come in his 3rd season. But I actually don't think that Golden and Reed really overlap all that much, because what you really want Matthew Golden doing is run. I think you want him off the line of scrimmage. I don't necessarily think he's an X. They have a lot of X receiver candidates on that roster. I mean, even if it's just Romeo Doubs, who's a little bit sacrificial X, but did play really well last year. And I still think Dontavian Wicks is a guy that can, obviously we know he can get open. We know he can run good routes. Got to catch football. But he's like an X receiver candidate as well, given just the way he separates against man coverage. So to me, like, you have enough for Reed to be your slot. And I think Golden can be an X in like 2 receiver sets. He can stay on the field because he does threaten vertically. Like he to me, it doesn't profile as a true number 1 receiver. And I think like it's really getting into his routes quickly and separating on like kind of slants and curls. But man, like we talk about these like big in-breaking routes, like digs and posts, specifically off play action, when he can go against zone coverage, which he's going to get a lot of that in this Packers offense. Like schematically, it is a very good fit for him. So yeah, I was kind of, I wouldn't say lukewarm on Golden as a prospect, but when we were talking about him as, oh, he's the first receiver off the board and he's, going to go 12th overall to the Cowboys, I was a little out on that. But I think as a late first rounder to a team that everybody thinks like, yeah, they're looking for a number 1 receiver, easier said than done. But I think he brings like the verticality and ball winning ability down the field that this team needs. I just wonder like, what's the fantasy ceiling in this offense that is still rather crowded with a lot of young players and is run heavy as well.
Yeah, there's a lot of like things holding Matthew Golden back, but I think there is a discount for dynasty managers to get this sort of player, early entry wide receiver with first round draft capital, in a situation where, agreed, he's definitely not a true wide receiver 1, but he can be an opportunistic wide receiver 1 and sort of lead a room. So I've been sort of a resident Matthew Golden guy here. A lot of pushback in the Fantasy Points community here. And big shout out to Ryan Heath, who's led the Dontavian Wicks hive for many years, and he'll continue to do so. Let's talk about Keon Coleman. We talked about a lot of these wide receivers who are being mentioned as big breakouts. Coleman has sort of taken a big back seat. Very disappointing rookie season. I remember listening to you talking about him as a prospect, about how you thought he could really thrive as in a big slot role in the NFL. That hasn't existed in Buffalo. Do you think we're going to see a little bit more versatility with how Buffalo utilizes Coleman? I mean, he's really free right now in some dynasty startups. And in terms of underdog and redraft, he's pushed way down the board. I know they extended Khalil Shakir. They brought in Joshua Palmer. But it seems like a wide receiver room where maybe Coleman's a little bit under the radar and could take a step forward that some people are not calculating heading into year 2.
Yeah, look, he was a guy that, like we talked about with Jayden Higgins, is sub 35th percentile. He was actually the player I highlighted when doing that whole study. It's a video on YouTube on my channel people can check out. Again, like all the guys that are not college separators that have gone on to be successful in the NFL and become like consistent multi-year starters. We're not talking about like Christian Watson or like Will Fuller types, these kind of splash inconsistent players. I'm talking about like consistent high-end starters. They've all become big slot receivers. Well, I don't think Brandon Beane and the Bills brass watched that video, because I mean, Keon Coleman, they said it as soon as they drafted him and they meant it. He's their X receiver, which to me, you're just never going to become a consistent high volume player if you're a 3rd percentile success rate versus man player, 8th percentile against press in his rookie season. You're never going to be like able to separate at the level that you need to feed that guy a lot of volume. Now he's going to have big weeks because he honestly wasn't as good of a ball winner as I want him to be as a rookie. Like his contested catch rate was a little hit or miss, but he did have some big wins there, and he will, because he's just bigger than you and he is strong at the catch point. He'll just dunk on players. But to me, I do think his upside is it doesn't even have to just be a slot guy, right? Like just get him off the line of scrimmage. This is something I chart at Reception Perception. He was on the line of scrimmage on 76.3% of his sampled snaps. Like if we can get that down to maybe closer to 50%, because maybe Josh Palmer takes some X receiver work. I'm interested in how they view Josh Palmer, because I don't really, is he an X? Is he more of a flanker? Like they kind of wanted Amari Cooper to be their X last year, but then that did not really work out for a variety of reasons. So how Palmer ends up being used in this room, I actually think will be important for Coleman, because yeah, he's never going to overtake Khalil Shakir as the slot. Shakir's too good and he is too valuable in that role. But if we could just get him off the line of scrimmage, like away from, running 9 routes as an X receiver and curl routes, which he's just not good on, I think there could be more potential for Coleman, but I'm just skeptical what the role is right now.
Yeah, definitely an interesting one to keep an eye on. I think Coleman at this point, it's sort of a let's see what happens. And he's so cheap for me to take in a dynasty startup. I took him in a dynasty startup this offseason. It's sort of like, it's the cheapest guy with this sort of draft capital, this sort of profile that's actually going to be on the field a lot that I can get in this sort of cheap range. So we're still willing to take a shot, but I'm not optimistic about him having a huge step forward. Let's end it with this, Matt. Give us a wide receiver that was drafted on day 3. Give us a sleeper guy that checks off some boxes for you that you're excited about.
Ooh, drafted on day 3 that I was really excited.
You can extend it into round 3 if it's somebody maybe under the radar. Just any sort of sleeper wide receiver that we didn't talk about from this class that checks off some boxes for you at reception perception.
Yeah, I think a guy that definitely checks this box for me is Tory Horton from the Seattle Seahawks. I think if he was fully healthy, he would have gone like round 2, round 3. He goes to the 5th round. Good separator, works well on these like in-breaking routes. And man, is he not exactly what this Seattle Seahawks room needs? He's a 5th round pick. Okay. Like I'm not expecting him to come in as a rookie and shoot, maybe he will, but odds are against him as a 5th round pick to come in and be an immediate starter. But if he does, this is what this room needs. He could beat man coverage. He wins at the catch point. I'm very confident in JSN. I'm confident in him playing outside and being like an outside receiver in condensed formations in this offense. They're going to blur the lines anyways. But I think Horton was a really underrated prospect who checked a lot of boxes for me. Again, he ends up going in the 5th round. Really liked both the landing spot and the talent profile of Tory Horton this year.
Yeah, I love the Tory Horton call out. He had ridiculous usage at Colorado State, like an unbelievable producer, had a 96 catch season in 2023. Definitely an interesting one. And again, if Cooper Kupp fails to stay on the field, you could see Tory Horton take a big step forward as a rookie. So really, really fun name to keep an eye on. Matt, this was awesome. Let everybody know once again what you have coming out.
Hey, Theo, appreciate you having me, man. Yeah, this was a great conversation. Right now, year 2 wide receiver profiles, in addition to the prospect profiles, are up on receptionperception.com. Year 3 wide receivers will be hitting the site here in a few weeks. So I know the Dynasty players love the second-year receivers are actually always my favorite players to study, and I think people will love checking out those profiles right now.
Yeah, highly recommend all of Matt's work and highly recommend you stick with Dynasty Life. We're going to be bringing on awesome guests each and every week. Also, check out our updated Dynasty rankings over at Fantasy Points. Scott Barrett, Ryan Heath, and I put in a ton of work into them, and I think they're going to help you crush your Dynasty startups. And we'll see you back next week here on Dynasty Life.